My name is Saima Malik. I think I know most everybody on the call, but just as a reminder, in case you're wondering, I am the Senior Research and Learning Advisor at the Center for Education, and I've been working quite closely with Rebecca Rhodes, who is our point of contact for the Center for Distance Learning, working very closely with a lot of our colleagues at DEEP in the development of some of the deliverables. Resources essentially for you all to ensure that you have the support that you need from us as you implement distance learning in your countries. So today we are going to talk about one of those deliverables, and that deliverable is a roadmap for measuring distance learning. As you all know, we have tried our best to be responsive to some of the questions that were coming up and some of the immediate needs that came up right after COVID-19 and school closures, with the COVID task team. And so the distance learning sort of subgroup within the Center for Education focused on responding to those questions that were very specific around, firstly, colleagues who had not worked with distance learning before, questions around what are the terminologies that we use, what are the modalities, how exactly do we do this? We've been doing this in person and now we have to do this remotely. So at first we had a literature review that we had shared out with everyone that helped to answer some of those initial questions at that point of pivot from in-person to distance, as well as provide some case studies and some examples for you all to look at to see, distance learning was not new. It had been ongoing for years and years in many locations where we have programming. So we wanted to bring that experience to those of you for whom this was a newer a way of providing education service. Following that, once folks were kind of, had started implementing and things were underway, one of the questions that we started hearing a lot from missions was, okay, we're doing this, but then how in the world are we supposed to measure what it is that we are delivering? We don't know how best to measure reach of our radio programming, for example, or engagement of our television programming, or a big one, learning outcomes. How do we measure whether or not our learners are learning what it is that we intend them to learn through distance learning? So we had a lot of those questions coming in, and this particular deliverable was developed in response to those questions. It does a number of things. It provides a review of the ways and the strategies that folks had been using for years and years, tried and tested to measure some of those components. It also looked at some innovative strategies that people were trying in the wake of COVID-19 and school closures and brought them into one place so folks could take a look at those examples, see if they were relevant, and try them out in your context. And then importantly, it put together a roadmap, which essentially was a guide, a step-by-step guide for those of you in the missions to take a look at and see, okay, how do I go about planning measurement, evaluation, and learning plan for distance learning specifically? So this document, which I hope you've all seen, and if you haven't, I'm just going to go ahead and put that into the chat. Here's the link to it. It's available on EduLinks, and if you have some time after this call or later, please take a look at this. This is a very rich document. It's got a lot of information that's going to be very useful for those of you who are in the midst of these questions right now. We're going to talk about this particular deliverable today. If we could take a look at the agenda, please. So next slide. We don't have very much time together, but the time that we do have, here's what we're going to be doing. Following this welcome, we are going to screen for you a very exciting video that our colleagues at DEEP have put together. And what that video does essentially is it distills the key takeaway messages from this document. The document is fabulous, it's rich, it's got a lot in there, and I would highly recommend everyone to take a look at it. But one of the benefits of the video is if you don't have much time and if you really want to get to what are the key takeaways in sort of an engaging way, share that with other mission colleagues, share that with folks in the ministry, that video is going to be very, very useful tool. So that video is now ready. It's going through our clearance process. As soon as the link to that video is available, we're going to send that out to you all. So please keep an eye out particularly at that internal newsletter that comes out from the Center for Education. Oftentimes some of these resources are kind of buried there in the section. And so if you haven't been looking at that section of resources within the internal newsletter, please highly encourage you all to take a look at that. So we'll share the link that way. Then we're going to talk about some of the learning points from this roadmap. We're very delighted and lucky to have some folks who are experts in this field on the call today, and they are here to hear the questions that you all have and respond to some of those frequently asked questions in real time, which is amazing. So I think we will, given how many people we have on the call, we may not do a breakout session. We might have a nice a cozy group here, so we might be able to just have a session on the main page here, I guess. But we'll talk about then key takeaways from that discussion, and then we'll have closing remarks. So just to give a little bit of an overview of the points that we're going to be going over later today. I do want to go ahead and mention before we start to look at this video, which is really, really nice, is next week, for those of you who may have the time and are interested, or colleagues who may have the time and are interested, there are two events that are going to be very relevant to this topic that are happening next week. One is on the 22nd on Tuesday, and one is the 24th, which is Thursday. On the 22nd, we're going to dive much more deeply into how to measure distance learning programming that is taking place either through radio or television modalities. And then on the 24th, the same topic, but focusing very closely on online modalities. So you have a choice there. This is a public event open to partners, not just mission staff, but highly recommend you all to join if you're able to do so. And the registration link is there. Before we get into looking at the video, I know that we have our producer here who would like to talk through some of the tools available on this page here. So I'm going to hand over to Mutsa, who's our producer, who will talk us through some of those. Over to you, Mutsa.
Thank you so much, Saima. I'm glad to meet with everybody. All right, so we'll be going through some of the tools that we use in Google Meet. And firstly, please make sure that your layout is set to Spotlight so that you can see our speakers. And to do this, click the three dots at the bottom toolbar, select Change Layout, and choose Spotlight as indicated on the slide here. And let us know in chat if you have any issues getting there, and we'll gladly assist you with that. Okay. And then for our feedback tools, you may find the Raise Hand tool on your bottom toolbar. So to raise your hand, just as you do in a face-to-face session, click on Raise Hand, and the facilitator will ask you to come off mute and speak. And then for closed captioning, to use, so for closed captioning, if you look at the bottom of your screen there, if you see, you should locate that CC button there. If you like closed captioning, just click on that, and that should pop up for you. So that is handy for you if you'd like to use that. And then we have the main chat box. The main chat box is where you can type in your questions, communicate with other participants. So if you click on that at the bottom right corner of your screen there, the chat box, if you click on that, you should be able to communicate with the facilitators. And if you want to make a comment and want people to read it, that's the tool for that. Cool. And with that, I will hand it back over to Saima, and then we should be getting into a video.
Thanks so much, Mutsa, for that. I will note that our speakers will be talking about and addressing some of the key questions that have come back to us around measurement of distance learning. But we also want to acknowledge the fact that those of you who are joining the call from missions may have more specific questions that you would like to ask that you are dealing with currently on the ground. So please be thinking about those questions, and I would highly recommend that once we get to that section of discussion, please bring up those questions. We want to make sure that we are able to fully leverage the expertise that we have on our call today. So what I would like to do now is to hand over to Mutsa to share the video. Again, This video will highlight key takeaways of that roadmap document that we put in the chat that's available on EduLinks. We hope this will be a much more engaging and fun way to take a look at those takeaways, and we will share the link to this video as soon as we are able to with you all. I see Rebecca Rhodes has also just joined the call. Rebecca, as you know, is our point of contact for distance learning, and I'll be handing over to Rebecca and Emily Morris, one of the authors of this roadmap, right after this video. So Musa, if you could please play the video for us. Thank you.
The Roadmap for Measuring Distance Learning provides strategies for capturing reach, engagement, and outcomes. This video shares 3 key strategies and provides an example of how to apply these strategies to one distance learning modality, video programming. As countries around the world closed learning institutions in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a surge in distance learning initiatives. Distance learning is commonly used to reach learners who need flexible learning opportunities, such as working youth or where schools and learning centers cannot be routinely and safely reached. When implemented intentionally, distance learning can expand learning opportunities. What is distance learning? Distance learning is broadly defined as teaching and learning, where educators and learners are in different physical spaces. Often used synonymously with distance education, distance learning takes place through one of 4 modalities: radio or audio, television or video, mobile phone, and online learning platforms. Printed texts frequently accompany these modalities and can also be a 5th modality in cases where technology is not used. Distance learning can serve as the main form of instruction or can complement or supplement in-person learning. As countries and education agencies take up distance learning, it is important to design and implement evidence-based and intentional strategies for monitoring and evaluation. This video outlines 3 interconnected strategies for measuring reach, engagement, and outcomes in distance learning. These include integrated remote and in-person data collection, multimodal technology interfaces, and mixed methods data collection. Using a combination of these strategies will help ensure quality, equitable, and inclusive data. Key strategy number 1, integrated remote and in-person data collection. Remote data collection provides timely data on reach and engagement and can be used when in-person data collection is not feasible. In-person data collection is preferable for measuring outcomes including attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, and where building rapport with learners is critical. Combining remote and in-person data collection enables more frequent, responsive, and systematic data collection in emergency and non-emergency contexts. One example of integrated data collection is measuring learning engagement in video programming using both in-person and remote methods. Key strategy number 2, multimodal technology interfaces. Technology interfaces include phone or video calls, interactive voice response, text messages, social media groups, paper, images, video and audio recordings, learning management systems, and educational apps, programs, or games. Measuring distance learning through multiple technology interfaces helps reach a wider group of participants, including those with limited access to technology and connectivity. Interfaces should be selected based on technology device access and accessibility needs, connectivity, and demographics of the users. One example of using multimodal interfaces for measuring engagement in video programming is combining phone calls, social media groups, educational apps, and paper-based protocols to collect data. Key strategy number 3, mixed methods data collection. Quantitative data collection methods include surveys, tests and assessments, teaching and learning analytics, and observations. Qualitative data collection methods include qualitative observations, focus group discussions, interviews, and participatory and arts-based research. Combining quantitative and qualitative methods allows for deeper analysis and provides greater opportunity to measure intended and unintended reach, engagement, and outcomes. One example of using mixed methods for measuring engagement in video programming is combining surveys and learning analytics data with focus groups and voice commentaries. Using a combination of integrated remote and in-person data collection, multimodal technology interfaces, and mixed methods data collection will help ensure quality, equitable, and inclusive data. To bring our example of measuring engagement in video programming together, we integrate remote and in-person data collection, combine multimodal technology interfaces, and mixed methods by using in-person focus group discussions and paper-based surveys, remote phone surveys, recorded voice commentaries, and social media group conversations, and learning and engagement analytics captured through educational apps. For more examples and case studies, and to learn more about the steps in measuring reach, engagement, and outcomes, visit the Roadmap for Measuring Distance Learning.
Thanks so much, Mutsat. Hopefully you all enjoyed that video. We found it was a very useful and engaging way to get those key talking points, key takeaways from the roadmap into one place. We understand that this might be a useful video for you all to have and share with colleagues on the ground, as well as perhaps with Ministry of Education counterparts. So what we're going to do is share that link with you as soon as we're able to. I would like to now hand over the microphone to Rebecca Rhodes, who, as you know, is our point of contact for distance learning within the Center for Education, and Emily Morris, who is the lead author of the roadmap document itself. So over to both of you. They're going to talk through the key concepts from that document. Over to Rebecca and Emily.
Thank you, Saima, and welcome everybody. It's really nice that you could make time to look at this important resource with us this morning. We've really benefited greatly from Dr. Emily's work and that of her team and colleagues, Yvette and Mary, and so many other contributors who are on this call. So the roadmap for measuring distance learning will take more of a deep dive now into some of the important concepts in it. I've highlighted one of those in the chat, and we'll keep coming back to that, this trio of reach, engagement, and outcomes, and how you're going to measure each of them. But what we also wanted to do is try to frame this presentation around the questions you had sent in when you registered for the webinar, and we'll have chances to discuss those in more detail. But you'll hear me referring to those as I go forward. And if you have other questions, please put them in the chat. This is your chance to really kind of get your question out there, and we'll do everything we can to answer it. So let's go to the next slide. Yeah, that slide, exactly that slide, sorry. So according to those questionnaire responses that you sent in, most of you in the missions are looking at monitoring and evaluating the outcomes. I had talked about that trio: reach, engagement, and outcomes. Most of you are on the outcomes concern of that trio. And you said in your responses that your challenges were about measuring outcomes, changes in learning and knowledge, and then followed by changes in engagement or capturing use and coverage. So we want to keep in mind that you want to be looking across all three of those. And what I'm going to put out there for you just now is to think about how it's really not possible to measure outcomes if you haven't checked on your reach and on your engagement. I mean, it's possible, but you might put yourself at risk, because if you are trying to measure an outcome but your reach is pretty poor, necessarily your outcome results will not be what you had been hoping for at the mission level. So when you're working with partners, try to be gentle. They do need to establish reach and establish engagement, and then look at the outcomes they're achieving once we know those things are in place. Let's go to the slide with the lovely map. We did want to let you know that the roadmap document that we do encourage you to read through. It's really nicely organized, has guiding questions, has key concepts, has recommendations. The roadmap document is not just from our heads, and it's not just from here in DC. What Emily and her team were able to do was actually look at interviews and case studies with about 25 experts and implementing partner groups. So that's Dr. Emily Morris, as I've said, and of course, Anna Farrell needs full credit for her work on this as well. And so what the roadmap contains is this fascinating consolidation of the information from those experts and implementing partner groups and the 13 case studies that were looked at, so that it was possible to look across this universe of practices and really ground on that the recommendations for how best to measure reach, how best to measure engagement, how best to measure outcomes, and eventually what thought process to follow to put in place a monitoring and evaluation plan that would touch on reach, engagement, and outcomes. So next slide, slide 10 with the actual roadmap. Great. So the roadmap document outlines 8 steps, which we definitely would encourage you to encourage partners to go through and to check off as they're putting in place a monitoring and evaluation plan for any distance learning intervention. There are also tools and resources included in the roadmap for accomplishing each step. So just in case, you know, you're visually challenged like me, you start the roadmap up there at step 1, and then you kind of come over to the right and then down and around, and you'll go through steps 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then there's 5, 6, 7, and 8. And what we want to be sure you know here is that what we'll talk about in some depth today is steps 1, 2, 3, and 4, but 5, 6, 7, and 8 are also important, and we really think that it's worth looking at the whole roadmap and all the information and tools about it when you're working with your partners to have your distance learning efforts monitored and evaluated. So next slide, please, where we begin to talk about the internal and external objectives. So as you'll see in step 1, which is really important, you have to put the time into this, it's determining the aims and objectives of the monitoring and evaluation that you want to see done. Of course, there can be multiple of those. And what we recommend in the roadmap document is thinking about 4 key internal and external objectives and sort of parsing out for your particular situation and your particular application of distance learning, the mix and match of those for you and how important each one is and really what the purpose is of your monitoring work. So internally, obviously, within learning institutions, within governments, within programs, you can use data to inform program management as well as teaching and learning. So it can also guide the adaptation and sustainability of programming towards the aim of accountability. So internally, you can try to have a MEL plan that will, you know, do a lot of work for you in terms of giving you the upfront data you need to make changes, make adaptations, make course corrections, et cetera. And to keep your investments as profitable as they can be in the distance learning space. Externally, obviously, you can use, you can frame your MEL plan, structure your MEL plan to generate global knowledge and further the evidence base and to inform accountability purposes that are related to costing, scaling, replicating, expanding outward from a first attempt in distance learning. Slide 12, please, the one with the key questions. So in your own projects or in the projects that you're managing in the field, what you may be thinking about is why am I measuring this distance learning, or why is my partner doing that? And we encourage you to ask that question, right? How will this data be used? Who is the audience for the evaluation? And that way, from the front end, when you're starting the work of implementation, you can also be ensuring that you have a MEL plan that aligns with what you want to measure and that really captures the range of data across reach, engagement, and outcomes that is ideal for your context. Emily, over to you.
Great, thanks, Rebecca, and great to be with everyone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about step 2. And as you saw covered in the video, this is really determining what will be measured. And as we have framed it for you, it's the reach, engagement, and outcomes. Reach being the access to technology devices, infrastructure, connectivity, engagement, being participation, enjoyment, relevance of the program. Outcomes really being change and knowledge, skills, attitudes, behaviors, and the teaching and learning. And so in the roadmap document, we lay out illustrative metrics for you to think about with your teams and for teams to think about. But we also want to reiterate that, to Rebecca's point earlier, is that it's not about which of these to measure, it's about how to measure all of them, because all of them inform the quality, inclusivity, the equity of data, and being able to measure that in our programming. So again, these are critical to have in all of the programming, and as to Rebecca's point, they may start in different steps, but planning these out is important because quality is not just looking at outcomes, but quality is also analyzing the reach and equity and engagement throughout. Some of the questions that we have around step 2, so next slide, please, is really how are reach, engagement measured and outcomes measured in distance learning programs. So we've addressed that in the roadmap, but what are some examples, giving concrete examples of these measures, providing some recommendations on how teams can build these into systematically and intentionally into plans and designs, and then thinking about equity analyses throughout, equity in reach, equity in engagement, equity in outcomes, and really for key recommendations using reach, engagement, and outcomes measures that are feasible for the communities in the context with which your teams are working, and identifying who's being reached and engaged and who is not. As we know, distance learning does not reach everybody in the same ways, and we need to be measuring and monitoring that as we go. Next slide, please. So part of this step is also USAID is in the process of drafting a standard foreign assistance indicator, which really looks at reach and is going to measure the percent of learners regularly participating in distance learning programming funded with USG education assistance. So this will come out with further guidance from USAID, but is an important part of collectively monitoring and looking at questions of reach and the work that we're doing in across programs and countries in our missions. The next step is really determining how data will be collected. And as we saw in the video, this could be remote, in person, and is recommended as key strategy is integrated wherever possible and feasible. The roadmap includes a decision tree that walks users through these key decision points for determining which technology and whether or not it should be remote, in person, or a mixture of both. Next slide, please. Some of the key questions to ask in this step is, should data be collected in person or remotely? Key considerations, for example, safety of teams, feasibility of technology. We need to think about equity considerations. When we're determining this, we need to also look at technologies that should be used. Are we using modalities of phone, and we need to look at measurement through phone and others, or are we looking at online learning and computers? So we need to be aware of that. And then key recommendations is to use the integrated in-person and remote approaches, as mentioned and reiterated here with the video, and ensuring marginalized individuals are included in this data collection. Step 4 is really determining the approaches for measurement. So this is the quantitative, the qualitative, or mixed methods as we recommend. And as the video went over, there's a whole lot of different qualitatives, from focus groups, interviews, qualitative observations, and quantitative measures as well, analytics, surveys, tests, and assessment, but trying to determine which are appropriate for the what you're trying to measure is critical. Some of the key questions that we help think about and answer in the toolkit: what methods can be used, what technologies and interfaces should be used, and what kinds of equity analyses. And again, our recommendation is using mixed methods to collect data formatively and summatively, and to ensure that data collection efforts are not further marginalizing participants. So finally, going forward, we will now hear from some of our experts that will talk to us about some of their thoughts, reflections, and learning on measuring distance learning. So we can stop sharing the slides, and I'm going to introduce Dr. Hetal Thukral, who has joined us. And Hetal has over 19 years of experience in implementing international education programs from the US and abroad, with a focus on program evaluation and improvement at the federal and local levels. She's conducted evaluations, research studies, policy linking, designed monitoring systems for projects with USAID, African Development Bank, World Bank, UNESCO, DFID, NSF, and several other institutions. We are also joined by Dr. Anna Farrell, who is one of the co-authors of the roadmap and is also an online educator with Lawrence and Concordia Universities. We have Yvette Tan with us, who is one of the co-authors of the forthcoming Comprehensive Distance Learning Toolkit, the Toolkit for Developing Comprehensive Distance Learning Strategies. And we have Gael Simon, Technical Director at Management Systems International, joining us as well. So we will be starting with some of the questions that you all submitted when you registered, and then we'll be opening it up for you to ask questions live in this session to pose, and we will answer those the best we can. So I'm going to ask Heta to start with the first question, and I will post these questions also in the chat, so if it's easier for you to read them. How do we monitor reach with children who don't have access to the internet and are using modalities like radio, television, and other modalities?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I think this one, it's important to first underscore what the monitoring data are used for. So that's step one, really underlining the purpose of it. And here, monitoring data on reach can actually serve two purposes. One, to know that the judgments made about impact, so the outcomes are qualified, but also to know formatively how programming might need to adjust. So when students are accessing programming offline, monitoring for one or both of these purposes, really, the options, the suggestions I have, some apply to formative and some apply to more summative uses. But here are just a couple of ideas. One way to reach children who don't have access to the internet is to work the links, the community links that you have. So this would be something like a snowball sample that you can identify respondents based from those who you can reach. So it might be community leaders, it might be teachers, it might be parents, it might be other listeners who do have access to the internet or have phones that you can survey and then identify others who you need to be reaching, particularly by asking things like who are others in your community or that you know that might be listening to this program or offline. Another way, and this is likely one that you'd want to use if you are relying on, you're going to be using the reach information to kind of make that link to outcomes, is to have a household level survey. So that can be something more random where you are randomly sampling households from a community and then surveying everyone. That is definitely more time intensive, but it does yield that that data that has less variability and more confidence. Another one is to actually wait to capture your reach through an evaluation sample. There's typically more resources for that kind of sample, and you can do something like a household survey or face-to-face surveys with children. And finally, just remember that regardless, there will always be gaps in these methods, meaning you're likely to still have some group that might be underrepresented. So perhaps always securing some funding or some approach that will target those hard to reach groups in a specific way, either through qualitative approaches or otherwise. So if you are able to have like a limited face-to-face, then saving that for groups that you know through snowballing and other ways you may not reach regardless. But at the end of the day, whatever approach you do use really does need to be fit for purpose for what those data are going to be used for.
Thanks so much, Heta. I'm going to ask you also to respond to the next question.
Sure.
Engagement, and how do you ensure that during data collection that's of satisfaction, participants are not just giving information to appease the monitoring or evaluation teams?
Yeah, so desirability bias is hard to protect against, but there are definitely ways to do that. A lot of them live within how you design the survey. Some of them live within how we sample, but also how the enumerators and the person asking the questions are trained. With desirability bias, which I think this question is asking, I'd also add in the way we ask questions, and this is definitely part of the design. The response options can also lead people to answer in ways that maybe aren't always true to what they're thinking. So for example, people tending to pick the first option. So if you have a 5-point scale, always kind of being drawn towards the first one, which may be the positive end or the negative end. So a couple of ways to build in additional checks to surveys, which is usually the best way to deal with this, is to ask for the information in a couple of ways. So throughout the survey, ask the questions in different ways, but intersperse them throughout. So how would you rate the program? Elsewhere, you might ask, how likely are you to recommend the program? How likely are you to turn on the program if you have nothing else to do? And there's lots of extant survey questions, so no need to reinvent the wheel and create your own items. But having checks throughout, so it's not just 1 or 2 items that you're relying on. And also like a set of items, so usually you can come up with a scale so that you're not relying just on the single item response. Another check that you can build in is weed out respondents who aren't really paying attention or might be answering kind of like down the line. Ask questions that are kind of crazy questions or that no one would say yes or no to. The sky is green on most Wednesdays, for example. It would catch them by surprise if they're reading it, and they would ideally answer no or false. Again, make sure on the response options, make sure that they're reasonable. Too many, you won't get people who discern between them, and too few, people don't really know where they fit. So then they are, tending to go towards the ones that are more appeasing. And then most importantly, like the consent statements and the training of the enumerators, knowing that there's no implications for the responses, and the enumerators being able to really clarify for the respondent that their true response or their true opinion here is really being solicited. And most importantly, triangulate. So don't rely on 1 or 2 items or even just one source. You can ask across students, parents about their students, community members about what they're hearing, especially if you have a shadow audience.
Thanks, Hetal. And maybe I will reiterate from the toolkit, from the roadmap, and having spoken to all of the different groups that are looking at questions of engagement, they also recommended during the formative evaluation process, during the development of the programming, to do some in-depth looking at qualitatively with intended user groups, whether it's caregivers, teachers, students, all of them, adults, and to really do some in-depth qualitative looking at engagement, as well as some of the programs such as Farm Radio International and Bungo are building in measures in their actual programming, so SMSing with various engagement questions as well, so that those are also built into the process, as well as building, and so you have data during the development process, as well as to Hetal's point of continually looking at that too, as well as when programs are out and being broadcast or being used in a learning setting. I'm going to move on to one of the questions on outcomes. And the question was, what are some innovative ways to measure learning outcomes for different modalities? And I think Mary Burns, who has answered this in our last panel, could not join us for this panel, but as she mentioned, this really depends on the modalities. And next week, we are really going to dig into this on the 22nd for the radio and television questions, and on the 24th, the online ways of measuring learning outcomes. So we'll talk a little bit about this, but we also want to give you a chance to answer questions. So if you have specific questions on learning outcomes for the particular mission related work that you're doing, please let us know. But otherwise, we will also explore these in depth next week. And I'm going to pose another question that was looking at how can we assess the cost-benefit trade-offs of the different modalities to decide whether which modalities are feasible. I'm going to ask Yvette to speak a little bit to this, and Hetal, if you have anything to add as well. Yvette, you can speak.
Thanks, Emily. So in thinking about cost benefit and in deciding which modalities are more feasible, it's really important to think about who the majority is, what technology is already available to them, what kind of content is already available that the majority can access, but also thinking along with that, who the most marginalized are and how to reach them. So in weighing your costs and benefit, it's really thinking about the majority and the most marginalized side by side. Actually, the distance learning toolkit, which will come out, has a whole section on cost considerations for developing a distance learning strategy to implementation, from what kind of costs you will incur from designing it to implementing it to monitoring and evaluating it. And also, Education Link has a really good resource on cost analysis. There's a USAID cost analysis guidance, which can be helpful in assessing cost benefit. I can share that link here. Oh,
perfect. Thanks. Yes, and I dropped that USAID cost measurement in the chat. So if you have more on that, thank you so much, Yvette.
Thanks, Emily.
Perfect. I will move on to the next question. And the question was, can we compare distance learning to in-person learning? Why or why not? And I'm going to ask Gael Simon to respond to that, as well as Hetal. Any thoughts you have?
Hi, everyone. Can we compare distance learning to in-person learning? I think we could. However, I think we need to be very careful. There are a lot of psychometric considerations that people need to take into account. When we do that, I think one of the big questions that emerged last year with a lot of programs were projects who had baseline or midline data and wanted to conduct the midline and endline, but then your initial data was conducted in person and now you're transferring to a remote based modalities or administration mode for your outcomes measurement. And that's very difficult to do. So it's really difficult to take data that was collected in person and compare it to data that's collected remotely. Children particularly don't process information in the same way. You have to consider how the responses will be provided. Doing remote assessment limits your options for respondents to demonstrate their knowledge and their skills. So that will limit the type of assessment that you can actually conduct. In the case of something like EGRA, you need to really consider whether or not a 1-minute subtask should be timed the same way when you're doing it remotely versus when you're doing it in person. So I would say there are a lot of things to consider before jumping in and taking in-person data and trying to compare it to remote data.
Yeah, and I'd just add that I think this comes back to purpose. So Gael, what you're describing, one purpose is that you've shifted midpoint from a face-to-face to a remote or distance mode. And I think when we ask about can we compare, it really has to be fit for purpose. So I think the hardest part about using that kind of data is that you make the case that an in-person and a distance learning are comparable instructional methods, right? So it's like saying instructional method A is comparable to B, and they're typically not. The experience of a face-to-face learning situation is very different from the distance learning. So even if we can cook up a way to make those comparable psychometrically, and the assessments are the same, you still have to qualify that the experience and the inputs, the interventions were comparable. And I think that's where it starts to fall apart conceptually, right? Because you're really comparing apples to oranges. And And if there's a need to say, well, how do these two compare, like more of a research design, then there's ways to come at that. But your assessments, like Gael said, are likely going to look very different. So if you're doing in-person learning and you're doing an in-person test, remote learning, remote tests, those are going to look very different. If you're doing in-person tests and two different, in-person learning and remote learning, then that in-person test possibly is comparable. So it really depends like what you're trying to do with that data. That also determines the investment level that you'll have to make to get that kind of data.
Thank you. And just another plug for next week, Barbara Means, who will be on the online learning panel, has been really doing this research in online learning and comparing these. So she will have a lot of insights because to reiterate everyone's point, this looks a little bit different in online learning than it does the other modalities. So she'll be speaking to that further next week. I'm going to ask one more question. I'm going to pose it to Gael, but I'm going to, in a minute, open it up to all of you. So if you want to start thinking about your questions and getting them ready, you can either put your questions into the chat or feel free to raise your hand, and we will take your questions in response to sort of the work that you're doing with your mission. So the last question I'll pose for Gael before handing it off to all of you for questions is, how do we measure the quality of programming?
Okay, there we go. I think that's what we've been talking about, right? I think when we look at quality of programming, we need to take a look at both reach, engagement, and outcomes. We need to take a look at the program at the formative stage. So for formative purposes, not only we tend to do a lot of pilots and then we move on, but we need to do a formative assessment of the program throughout the implementation, as well as formative assessment of the outcomes, right? And then we do the summative assessment as well. I think in terms of how you go about doing it specifically will depend on the context, will depend on the programming, will depend on your modalities. But quality of program really must focus on all three of the dimensions we've been talking about, and should include both formative and summative measures.
Thank you so much for that. And then just for those of you that formative and summative might be more new language, formative is often used for informing, so teaching and learning. That's not high stakes, that's for informing what's happening in the classroom. It could be check-ins that teachers are using, or it can also be testing out programming. The summative meaning drawing more conclusions from teaching and learning outcomes. So it's different types of measures, but to Gael's point, they're all important to measuring quality. So I just wanted to go now to all of you. If you feel, we'll pause for you to write a question into the chat or to raise your hand, and we can address specific questions that you have at your missions or in the work that you're doing on distance learning. And so I will start with Enoch, who has a question. So Enoch, it's handing over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. Yeah, my question, I was still typing, but I figured speaking would be easier. My question is related to one that has already been answered, I think, by Gael. But in Rwanda, we have just done a nationwide survey, and what we, after schools reopening, and what we found out was that actually students performed better in that survey for reading. So we are not sure whether this is correlated with distance learning that was done when schools were closed for nearly 8 months, or it is correlated with something else. So my question is, how do we know, how can we tell? Because we've conducted 2 different sample surveys, and children are performing much better than we anticipated. So we are left surprised. That is one. And then the other one is just a comment, especially from a challenge that we have faced before. I know we are thinking about measuring equitable way, think about equity analysis, but what we have faced here in Rwanda still is the students with disabilities, especially those with multiple disabilities. It is really hard to measure outcomes, like somebody who is nonverbal, who's deaf. Like what measuring tools or what modalities would you use for somebody with multiple disabilities? And this has led them to be left behind, honestly. We are thinking, yeah, we have tried to be creative, try to do in person and talking to the parents directly, but still, yeah, there are different tools that are being used for different children. So you really can't tell, like when the results come in, you really don't know what has brought about this change, whether they have performed well or not. So just those two questions or comments would be, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you so much. Those are fantastic questions. Hetal, Gael, do you have any, to the first question about sort of understanding and unpacking some of the results that they've been seeing? Any thoughts?
Hetal, did you want to start?
Sure. So if were they quantitative surveys, and so you just have that and no follow-on? So just to make sure I understand, you did two surveys. They were different surveys, but they gave you very surprising results and higher results than you expected. So you're just trying to unpack why?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Two surveys, and they are both at a national, like nationwide sample. It wasn't like in a particular district, it was just nationwide sample, and the results, the students performed so well despite the schools being closed for nearly 8 months. We had distance learning. We conducted distance learning, and we did our own different surveys through phone and phone calls, through in person, and that's why we're waiting for this nationwide sample surveys to see whether what we found out in our own surveys was the same. But then we have been surprised, and these are two surveys, so we are wondering whether this is correlated with distance learning or there's something else that has happened. Of course, maybe you would need to have other information, like what tools we used, but I think this is, we're just confused at this point. We are confused, but in a good way. We just want to know, where there's a correlation or not.
So I think this is like the big thing that researchers do. We always put requires further study, right? There's all sorts of things that we uncover, but one of the, I've seen this actually on a couple of projects, and people being equally surprised in different countries that we've had a total shutdown, and we're anticipating massive learning losses, and that's not quite the trend that they're seeing. And I think what, as in terms of research, to unpack that, one thing is to just think about what are the alternatives that you can start to kind of cross off your list as possible. So if you do have the ability to collect other data or to do like in-depth studies, even with smaller populations, about, okay, what exactly were they doing? How were they engaging in learning? What might have actually mitigated that? While we thought, nothing was happening, things were happening. So I don't think you can actually get to causality of saying, because they were listening to the radio programs, that's why we're seeing these, but you can start to chip away at some of the other factors that might have affected it. And perhaps at some point narrowing down to who are the subgroup of children that maybe did listen to radio programs, did engage, all of that, and saying, were their learning outcomes different than those who think we may not have engaged as intensely? And so you could start to talk about what the distance program bought you, or it impacted, what the impact of it was. But right now, I think it's so broad, you probably can just start taking away all those alternative explanations.
Yes, and just to add, I think it's always very difficult for us to attribute outcomes to a specific intervention. So as Hetal was saying, it would be ideally you would have a group of students participating in the distance program versus a group not participating. So you would have a comparison group, and then you would be able to better judge whether or not the program has had a significant impact on the outcomes. But absent that, one thing that we did recently in Lebanon when we were looking at learning outcomes is that we had a lot of contextual data that was also collected. So we really wanted to understand learning engagement throughout the period. In Lebanon, we had COVID, but there's also a lot of economic crisis. So schools have been shut down for the greater part of 2 years. And so we wanted to understand not only how did the student engage with the distance learning programs that the government had put in place, that the project had put in place, but that the schools themselves had put in place, or that the parents had organized. And our preliminary data is showing us that about 10 to 12% of kids didn't engage with any of these programs at all, right? The majority of them participated with teachers only. But then we had another question is, how often were you participating in those programs with your teachers? And what were your engagement level, as we were talking about with that? But then we also found that 10 to 15% had parents who had organized other learning groups, right? And so that would explain for some of the students who maybe didn't get a lot of support from the school system itself, but then the parents brought in other resources to help. So it's really critical to have that contextual data. And we also did very intensive focus group discussions with school directors, teachers, and parents, just to get at the bottom of what really happened during that year. We won't be able to say this caused that, but we'll be able to say, this is what we were expecting. And again, we have to think about why our expectations are always lower, right? That's another point. But we were surprised by the results. And these are the factors that may explain why we're seeing something that's a little bit different than our expectations.
Thank you so much. And another plug sort of the key strategy number 3 is the mixed methods piece. I think that Hetal and Gael spoke to, and the need for qualitative data, because qualitative data cannot generalize. It cannot point to causality, but it helps, as Hetal said, chip away and understand deeper. We have Mayada with another question. So I just want to respond briefly to the question on the multiple disabilities, as I'm working on an evaluation right now on inclusive education in East Africa. And I think my word of advice was, you have to get people that are experts, that know how to do measurement with learners with multiple disabilities, but planning early and having those in the design is critical, because planning them too late is then acknowledging their marginalization after things have already been in place. And so getting expertise, and happy to share some resources, with you for some people that may be able to help support with the particular questions you have in your case in Rwanda. I'm going to ask Mayada if she doesn't mind unmuting and sharing your question, Mayada.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's kind of a follow-on from what Inak was talking about. I mean, when you're measuring learner engagement for the younger grades, are we really looking more of assessing what parental engagement was? Because younger students can't on their own engage with the material in the same way that the older students can. And so I'm not surprised at all by those findings in Uganda, because, parents become a teacher of, a one-on-one teacher, and therefore it's not, their children are no longer in classes of, 1 of 50 or 1 of 60. So of course they're, even in the more limited amount of time they might be spending, it's a 1-hour radio program or just a little bit of homework, that still might, vastly exceed the amount of one-on-one time they would actually get in a classroom environment. So I just wondered, in what ways is the tool tailored to the different age and grade levels to look more specifically at the parents who really take on that teacher role for younger students versus the older students, where we could expect to see maybe some more variance in how often a 14-year-old is logging in on their own or doing their homework on their own and isn't getting their hand held. But younger students certainly cannot do any of this stuff by themselves. Even tuning into a radio station is something the adult has to do for them. So yeah, I'm glad to hear that that's the case in Uganda, and maybe it'll make teachers think a little bit harder as they go back into schools about the approaches the parents were using as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Amanda. Important point, and I'll speak just kind of on the roadmap and then see if Gael or Hetal or Yvette. Yvette's also an early childhood educator and has been online these last couple of years, so might have important thoughts to add. I would say for the tool, for the roadmap, we have acknowledged that age and target group is really important. And so speaking back to sort of the triangulation and how you measure and what you measure, we don't, there is not a lot of research on online learning for small children. We've used it a lot in COVID out of necessity, but there isn't a lot of data, and particularly less data outside of the global north on whether or not online learning is the preferred or even works for small children. And I think there's a lot of cases also of where it hasn't worked. So I think that is discussed in terms of radio and television. There has been more study on that, particularly with television. Ubungo and Sesame have done large studies on that, and caregivers, of course, and parent engagement is a large factor in if you're measuring learning outcomes, if you're measuring engagement, if you're measuring reach. Those are all they're all critical across all age groups, but they're extremely critical for the early grade learners. And so some of the groups that we talked to in the roadmap also acknowledge that. So they're collecting some of the information directly from the caregiver. They're collecting some of the information from the child, if possible, but sometimes it's directly from the caregiver, and there's those limitations. And so they have sort of spoke to that in some of the research and how you need to set up research questions differently. So I think that's an important point. Gael, Yvette, or Hedda, do you have anything to add to Mayada's point in question?
Nothing from me, Emily.
Okay.
With preschoolers, well, it's all very experimental right now. So the way that we've done it, but then also because it's a very different demographic as well. Because like for you to do online assessments for very young kids, they have the internet connection, they have the equipment, and in their cases, they had a parent with them or a caregiver with them. And then the assessment is really one-on-one on a regular basis. But it's a minority, like here in Manila, in the Philippines, where that's being done by mostly private preschools. So yeah, it's not easy.
Thank you. And I'm going to hand off to Judith, who has a question.
Thank you. As follow-up to Enoch's question, I hope you can hear me because I've been having internet issues. So I'm wondering if you had a setup of a longitudinal study, for a distance learning program, and you're faced with Enoch's situation where, during COVID, schools were closed, and you were just doing distance learning. And now schools are, have reopened, and they're doing both in-person and distance learning is still ongoing. Would that be an opportunity to factor in, to determine the level of attribution? Maybe you factor in some questions to determine the extent of which they have been truly engaged with the distance learning modality versus in person. Just wanted to throw that out there. Thank you. Over.
Thank you, Judith. And Hedda, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, first, kudos to maintaining a longitudinal sample over a pandemic. That's pretty impressive. And yes, I think the best idea at that point would be to try to disaggregate that population that you're able to follow and try to understand who participated more and who participated less, and try to then get at impact through that approach. And at least being able to compare that when students listen to the program more regularly, there was more fidelity of intervention that compared to those who don't. But the longitudinal then gives you much more confidence in the person, the sample level factors or the differences that you could have from having two different populations. I think it's still necessary to capture the demographics so you can understand that. But then, like you said, questions around how much they participated, et cetera. You might also want to then triangulate some of that. So it's not just the learner telling you, but also triangulating it through other sources, because that becomes like your primary dividing factor, right? You say, I know these kids participated more, And I know that because they said it. We have some parent report, we have some usage information, so we feel pretty confident that they did. And we compare them to those who haven't, and then you get at a more confident difference between the two.
Thank you so much, Hetzel, for that, and Judith for the fantastic question. So thank you all for your questions. We are running out of time, so I'm going to ask Rebecca Rhodes to come back in and go over some takeaways from today before we close out for the day. So Rebecca, handing off to you.
Thank you, Emily, and thanks to everybody for a very rich discussion. And, you know, I think that what that really shows, my first takeaway is that each time we do this, we're shaping and molding it to a particular set of realities. And that's really the spirit behind the roadmap. We don't have every answer ready to go for you with your distance learning interventions and those of your partners, but the idea behind the roadmap is that we definitely know the key questions to be asking. We know from the experiences, as I emphasized before, the roadmap is really built on a series of experiences. And so we know from those experiences what best practices are, and have tried to leverage that information in the roadmap document so that you can really get some good pointers along the way as you're traveling your own journey. I think in terms of takeaways for me, I mean, first of all, we're seeing, just leaping to the fore, we're seeing this kind of range of audience question, you know, who are the real intended audiences? What is their reality? When we think about Enoch's question, you know, what about the most marginalized? I think these questions around equity come up every time. Yes, thank you, Emma. We would love it if others would share their takeaways. It's not just I who can have takeaways. And so it's just these equity perspectives and lenses, and, you know, Emily and Anna really emphasized that in the roadmap, that all of this has to be done from an equity perspective. And by that, we mean your monitoring does also. So it's not just how do you execute and implement programming in an equitable fashion, it's what about your monitoring plan not only will help you get data on various aspects of equity, but will be inherently equitable in and of itself. How will you involve those who have trended toward being more marginalized in a given place in kind of the data collection, in the questioning process, in the qualitative information searching and seeking that you're doing. So I think that's really something that we see coming through very strongly, is this equity strand and the recognition that distance learning is actually inherently in its native resting state, as we found out in the United States during COVID. It's inequitable, right? It's easiest to provide to those who are already in possession of certain devices, certain electrical hookups, you know, certain advantages that others may not have. So if you're going to move it out of that resting state and into something that is responsive to questions around marginalization, then you're going to have to think about equity right up front in both your implementation and your monitoring. I think we're also seeing, and Emily, you know, you emphasized this, as did Anna in the roadmap write-up, and Yvette, we're seeing this need for just a really broad range of ways to collect the data. So, you know, mixed methods, qualitative, quantitative, using all the tools at your disposal, and then really thinking about the purposes and why you're seeking what information you're seeking and what the best way is to get it. And then the last thing I'll say, and others can have takeaways too, is just please remember, you know, at USAID, we tend to push partners to be really aggressive in terms of outcomes. And yes, that's good, Judith. And please remember that you do also have to know whether you're achieving reach and achieving engagement. Those two are sort of important prerequisites for an outcome. And then I guess last would be, we haven't talked that much about it this time around, but the questions around cost, and that came up in the earlier webinar, but just being sure that your monitoring plan is intentional about collecting cost data and really understanding the full costs of any intervention that you want to run or want to take to scale. But with that, yes, very nice. Why are you doing it, Enoch? That's a lovely takeaway. But with that, I'll stop with my own takeaways, and I love these ones that are coming through in the chat. Great contributions. And we really hope that you'll read the roadmap, look at the new distance learning indicator, and work towards working with it with your partners in the missions. And Simon, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks. Excuse me. Thanks so much, Rebecca. Thanks, everyone, for your contributions in the chat and also the perspectives that you've shared from your mission work. We hope that this has been a useful session for you all. We really wanted to make sure to highlight this useful tool. This is for you all to use. We put it in the chat, and I'm happy to put it in the chat again if that's helpful. Please take a look if you haven't at this roadmap. See how you can use this in the work that you all are doing on the ground. I also want to make sure to let you all know that we are working with our colleagues at DEEP on developing, and I think Emily mentioned this earlier, a comprehensive distance learning strategy, comprehensive distance learning toolkit development document. So it is a toolkit which will help you all to develop distance learning strategies. Now we see that ministries of education are at the stage where they would like to develop those comprehensive distance learning strategies that can be embedded within the education systems that are in place. And so this toolkit will be very useful in helping to guide the steps towards development of that strategy. That one is coming soon, and we'll be able to share that with you as soon as it's gone through the clearance process. Please look for that. Oftentimes some of these are sort of buried in the internal newsletters that come out from the Center of Education to you all on a monthly basis, as well as the link to the video that we've shared. Also, one final plug for the sessions that we are holding next week. We'll have some wonderful experts come and talk specifically about measuring distance learning through television and radio on the 22nd, and then online modalities on the 24th. And you can register on that link right there. Thanks again, everybody, for joining. Please keep in touch with us. Let us know as questions come up, as you face things on the ground that we are able to support with. Please keep us in the loop. We're really happy to see you all on the call today, and we look forward to continuing this discussion with you all moving forward. Thanks so much.